Welcome to the Earning Freedom Podcast. I am Michael Santos with michaelsantos.com and prisonprofessor.com, and I'm really excited today to be continuing this program on earning freedom. It is the mastermind course that I designed specifically for people in prison, for people in jail, for at-risk youth, for any individual who is living in struggle. What I like to share are the strategies that empowered me through 26 years in prison. And I know that some of the people are tuning in for the first time. Maybe you just surrendered. Maybe you're just in the course today for the first time. So I always take a little moment and recap what we discussed in earlier episodes for those of you who are new. Now, all of these are kind of standalone, but there is a path and a method that goes through it. And I always teach these stories through the lessons that I learned while going through those 9,500 days in prison, because I believe that the lessons that empowered me can empower anyone. That's why it's a mastermind course. It's not me. I'm not the mastermind. The mastermind that I try and teach from in this course was Socrates. It started with Socrates. And that's what I described in lesson 1, how when I was arrested in 1987 as a consequence of bad decisions I started making when I was 20 years old, I was eventually convicted for trafficking in cocaine, and I was facing a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. While I was contemplating the bad decisions that I had, I got influenced to read a philosophy book. Don't know why, don't know how. Perhaps it was some prayers to give me strength. But in any event, I found Socrates. And when I found him, I found that I could transform my life just like you can transform your life. It's up to you. It all begins with a question of how bad do you want it? And then I can tell you that in my case, I wanted it really bad. I really hated where I was. I was locked inside of the Pierce County Jail. I was facing a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. I knew the shame that I'd caused to my family. My parents were crying. My grandparents were so ashamed that they stopped speaking to me. I was just really sick with where I was, and I wanted to change. I wanted to find some kind of way to work my way back into society and come back not just, like a lot of people come out of the system. I wanted to come back strong with my dignity intact, ready to survive, ready to succeed. And that's what really motivated me. How did I do it? It all began with this concept of looking into the future and saying, who are the people that I want to impress? Who are the people that I want to prove worthy of their trust? Who are going to be my avatars? And that's what I suggest that you do. Think about the people in your future who you want to believe in you. If you can figure out who those people are, then you can go and take the next step and reverse engineer what is it going to take to prove worthy of their support. In my case, I wanted to connect with people like bankers and lawyers and professionals and people who might employ me or extend me credit. I wanted to make sure that my probation officer that I was going to see at some point in the future, I wanted him to see me as something different from the bad decisions that I made when I was 20 years old. And it was that motivation, that passion of looking into the future, into those people that I call avatars, trying to figure out what they would expect of me, that's what led me to the values by which I chose to define myself. And what were those values? For those of you who are looking at this for the first time or have seen it before, you will know that my values I defined as a commitment to education, a commitment to contributing to society, and a commitment to building a support network. If I could figure out how to do that through every day of my journey, I believed that I would have a different outcome. Once I embarked upon identifying those values, the next step was setting those clearly defined goals. In my case, how were my avatars going to define whether I truly was educated, whether I truly had contributed to society, whether I truly had built a support network? So I set clear goals, and those clear goals would help me define success. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't know how to determine whether I was really making it happen or not. So the focus for me was that, what do the avatars want? They would want me to earn a university degree. They would want me to find some way to contribute to society. I defined that as publishing. Build a support network. I needed to find 10 people who would believe in me. That was the method for me to break through the chains of confinement and start liberating my mind and liberating my way to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I felt as if like I was in a deep cave and I had to build my own ladder and climb out every single day. I had to climb my way out. And every step that I took was going to lead me closer. It would be defined by attitude as we discussed in lesson 3, making a 100% commitment to success, is I define success. How do you define success? Once you figure out your values and your goals, there's your definition for success. But the question is, what level of commitment are you going to make that happen? Second, after you make 100% commitment to success, that's where you are today. That's what this module is all about. This module, once you make that commitment, it is to have your aspiration. What is an aspiration? It's fundamentally different from a fantasy. It's fundamentally different from a wish. If you go to mailroom right now today, you're going to look at who gets mail, and that mailroom that's going to what are they going to deliver? You're going to see an abundance of magazines from like Robb Report and Architectural Digest and all these types of fancy things guys are going to be getting. Guys who can't buy commissary, but they're going to be sitting there dreaming of Ferraris and Lamborghinis and penthouses and and that's a wish. That's a fantasy. I didn't want to be filled with happy talk about what I was going to have. I wanted to create a deliberate path that would help me crush through expectations. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to see yourself as what is the best possible outcome. I'm not suggesting that it's not Lamborghinis and Ferraris and penthouse apartments and, oceanfront homes and architectural. Maybe that is your destiny. If it is, awesome. The question I have is, how badly do you want it? Because if you want it really badly, you are going to make that 100% commitment, and you are going to fully understand and appreciate how every decision you make along the way is going to be consistent with getting you there, or is going to lead you off track. That's the fundamental challenge that every one of us has to answer if we want to overcome struggle, if we want to become more successful tomorrow than we are today. We have to have this very clear plan that we can follow as the days turn into weeks, the weeks turn into months, the months turn into years, and for some of us, the years turn into decades. So my question is, what do you want to become? Once you answer what you want to become, then you can start sowing the seeds that are going to deliver that outcome for you. I knew I wanted something more than what I had in my past. I knew that I'd made a lot of bad decisions. I said that I started making those bad decisions when I was 20 years old, but the reality is it was much earlier than that. It was when I was in school, the friends that I chose, the decisions that I made not to do homework, not to study. I mean, let's be realistic here. We can all look in hindsight and say that any one of us had an opportunity. We went to school in the United States. Any one of us had an opportunity to study, to educate ourselves, to get into a university, to become a professional, or to build a career. Any one of us had that opportunity. But those like me who didn't have the good character or the discipline to truly focus, we fell off track. But right now, if you're going through this Earning Freedom Mastermind course, you have another opportunity. I've said it before, I'll say it again, that the best time to plant an oak tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. 20 years ago, before I went in there, I should have made different decisions. But I didn't. But once I started making those different decisions, my life changed. I no longer was confined. I was no longer a prisoner. Instead, I was embarking upon this plan that would deliver the outcome that I wanted. And what was that? Well, as I've said in earlier episodes, and I'll say again, the aspiration was I wanted to come back to society, be able to put on a suit and tie, stand in any room, and have everybody in that room respect me as a human being, as somebody who can add value and contribute, and not have a single one of those people, oh, that dude just got out of prison. And that's what I want for each of you. I want you to be able to come back to society and not face the stigma or the prejudice that comes around bad decisions from your past or current circumstances or a criminal conviction. Don't wait for other people to dictate your future. Seize the moment right now and say, I am not going to be one of these people who repeatedly come back into the prison system, who repeatedly get out of jail, go home with the best of intentions, but find an unfriendly job market, find an unfriendly credit market, find it difficult to find housing, find it difficult to obtain support. Just say, that's not going to be me. But don't be the person who just talks about it. Be the person that does something about it. That is the path of masterminds. That was the path of How many masterminds? I mean, I don't want to get political on this, but I want to just give a quick analogy here of President Barack Obama. Okay, because I was really impressed with his background. I remember before he was elected, and make no political things. It was just a matter of saying, here's a guy, African American, son of a single mother, educates himself with, granted, he had tutoring and all that stuff, but educates himself, puts himself through college, the best colleges, gets into Oxford College, I think here in Los Angeles, and then eventually Columbia, an Ivy League school, gets his undergraduate degree, gets into Harvard Law, becomes editor of the Law Review, which is extraordinarily challenging to do, and graduates at the top of his class at Harvard Law. I mean, somebody with that pedigree credential can go anywhere, can go on Wall Street, make as much money as he wants to make, go into business, go into anything with those credentials. A Harvard Law degree and being on the editor of the Law Review, you can do anything you want to do. What does he do instead? He goes into the streets of Chicago and becomes a community organizer. No money in that, but it was simply because he had a passion of wanting to improve people's lives. And regardless of his politics or anybody else's politics, I just admired that type of personal backstory, because it's somebody who had a bigger aspiration, an aspiration that was bigger than himself. And that's what I consider to be a mastermind. Somebody who says, I want to be something that's bigger than myself. And that's exactly the opposite of what I was when I was growing up. All I cared about was myself, was building a life for myself. Well, now that I've gone through those 26 years in prison, my focus is saying, what can I do to help more people emerge from struggle? What can I do to help more people find the same inspiration that I felt by reading about Socrates, or reading about Gandhi, an individual who reunited a country, or reading about Martin Luther King, an individual who worked so hard to reverse the injustices of civil rights violations, or be somebody like Nelson Mandela, who can go through 27 years in prison, not because he committed a crime, but because of the injustices of his own country, and come back without any anger or bitterness or hatred. Instead, simply wants to be a better person and build a better world. Or Viktor Frankl, another mastermind who inspired me. There are just so many. And I don't only go to philosophy or politics, but I go to business leaders as well. All of them begin with a very clear aspiration. And my question for you is, what is your aspiration? Because there are far too many people in jails and prisons that their biggest aspiration, I'm going to be a shot caller. I'm going to control the TV. I'm going to control this area of the prison. And that's awesome if that's what you want to do. But I would really encourage you to question, what is the outcome of that? How is that approach going to lead to my life after release? How is that going to differentiate what others expect of me? I knew what others expected of me. I told you that in episode 2. I told you what the prosecutor said at my sentencing hearing. Said that if Michael Santos spends every day of his life on an all-consuming effort to repay society, and if he lives to be 300 years old, our community will still be at a significant net loss. So I knew what the world expected of me. I knew that people would look at me and say, there's a guy who's going to prison. He's going to stay in prison for a long time, and he'll probably go back to prison. But I refused to accept that narrative, and I still do. I still refuse to accept what I can't do. Instead, I focus on what I can and showing you what you can do. And if you can do something, that's how we truly can be the change that we want to see in the world. It's begin with this question of what is the best possible outcome for your life. Understand what's coming if you don't. One of the paths that I took was to learn the backstories of the people who I was around in prison. I wanted to understand what it is that brings so many people back. And I'm going to tell you the story about one of my friends in prison after I give this quick message of gratitude to one of my sponsors. One of the sponsors I want to talk about is the California Wellness Foundation. It's a large philanthropy here in the state of California that works hard, sows seeds to build a better California and ultimately a better world. And I'm so grateful to the California Wellness Foundation because they have provided funding that allow me to do these types of programs and create these types of programs and spread them to other people in the country at no charge. I have more than 150 episodes on iTunes right now for the specific purpose of showing other people you can do better. And so I just want to take this moment to express my gratitude to the California Wellness Foundation and let you know that I'm always working hard to prove worthy of the trust that they've placed in me. And that's a message for you as well. Think about what you can do today to begin sowing these seeds so that people will invest in you. Regardless of what bad you've done in the past, regardless of what good you've done in the past, your success is dependent on the rent you pay every single day. How deliberate are you in preparing for the best possible outcome? If you can see it and truly visualize yourself in that environment, you can reverse engineer your way to getting there, because it doesn't happen by accident. That's one of the lessons I learned from Dwayne. Dwayne was a guy who served time in prison with me. And I remember talking with him when he came back to prison. He was a guy that inside the first time, I think he was in prison for the third time, I wrote about him in my book, Profiles from Prison. And he was a guy that went through prison, and while he was in prison, he did the best that he could. He got a job, he worked hard, he tried to stay out of trouble. I'm not saying he was a model inmate, but he was just a guy who was just trying to get through his time. And when he was trying to get through his time, he learned a skill set. He became a baker in the kitchen, and he finished his term, and he got out, and he was a baker in society. And he told me that he worked really hard to try and get a job, but all of the people in the grocery store, they would look at him as a guy that just got out of prison. They didn't want to hire him. Eventually, he gets a job, and he works hard, but the job doesn't pay much. Paid $11 an hour or something, whatever the going rate was for the lower end of the wage scale back then. And he's trying to make a living, working. He said, I worked 40 hours a week, as many hours as they would give me. But he said, at the end of the day, he said, every week it came, I had $2 left in my pocket after I paid all of my bills. And, my daughter would ask me for a pair of shoes or buy her this or buy her that. And he said, and I just felt emasculated. I felt like I was less than a man because I couldn't do it. And I'm 38 years old and I can't buy my daughter a lollipop or something like that. Why? Because I just don't have any money. And so when one of his homies came to him and asked him if he'd get back involved in trafficking drugs, he said, I said, okay, I'll try it. And I did it because I felt like I was in a bigger prison outside than I was inside. And of course, he got caught, and he'd come back, and he'd have another 20 years or 15 years to serve. And I'd listen to these stories over and over and over again, just as I'm sure each of you, if you ask around in that prison, wherever you are, in that jail, you're going to talk with people who are going to give you story after story after story. I can tell you there's not one person who gets out of prison and says, I'm going back. Everybody who gets out says, I'm never going back. But the reality is, they come back to the world, and that world is different from what they expected. They expected a world of Lamborghinis and Ferraris and penthouse apartments. I'd ask guys what they were going to do in prison. They said, I'm definitely going to make more than $100,000 a year. But what they don't understand is that out of every 100 people in the United States, only 5 of them make $100,000 a year. And out of those 5, I can guarantee you very few of them have prison records. I'm not saying you can't make $100,000 a year. I do. But I'm telling you, it doesn't happen by accident. It requires a deliberate steps. It requires that you sow seeds right now for the best possible future. You have to see what you want. And as I said in the last episode, you have to make 100% commitment to success as you define success. It may be your earnings. It may be something else. Maybe you want to be a good father. Maybe you aspire to be the best husband you can be. Maybe you aspire to be whatever. Those are your values and your goals. My only challenge to each of you is to think it through, is to plan, and to come up with a plan that is consistent so that you are not falling off track. Don't be like Dwayne, who didn't ask the right questions early on in his journey. If your hope is to become a baker or a cook, understand, well, what else can I do while I'm in here to make me the best baker in the world. If I want to be a carpenter, what can you do while you're in there to be the best carpenter in the world? When I would teach these classes in prison, I would always ask a question of somebody in the audience who said he wanted to be a tradesperson. I'd say, well, what's 3 plus 3? And they'd look at me like I was asking such a foolish question, and they'd say, it's 6. I'd say, awesome. Now turn to the back page of your GED book and solve a quadratic equation. And they'd look and say, I can't do that so easily. I said, I know. But if you focused yourself on learning math, how much better of a tradesman would that make you? How much more valuable would you be to an employer if you could do takeoffs on blueprints, if you could make measurements, these are skill sets that you can learn regardless of where you are. I had a podcast on here earlier on the Earning Freedom podcast where a guy described how he trained himself in computer languages despite him never having access to a computer, never having access to a keyboard. Simply by reading books, training himself, he was able to emerge from prison as a computer programmer and build an entire career around it because that was his aspiration. What is your aspiration? And how will that aspiration relate to the person you want to become in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Because to the extent that you sow seeds that will get you there, to the extent that you're deliberate on it and methodical, you can completely transform your life. And my message is to come in there and share, this is what worked for me. And I know the strategy, maybe not the same approach. Maybe you don't want to go to college. Maybe you don't want to become a writer or a speaker or a teacher. Maybe you want to become something else. Whatever it is, just walk it all the way through and figure out, if I pursue this path, how is it going to influence the outcome of my life? How is it going to relate to my happiness? How is it going to relate to me being able to muster energy and discipline and passion every single day? That's what the challenge that we all face is, to not allow these walls and these difficulties and these obstacles to extinguish our hope. Instead, we've got to create our own hope. We've got to create it from within and make things happen and motivate ourselves every single day. Not because you're going to get a single cell, not because you're going to get an extra bowl of Wheaties, but only because you say, this is how I define myself. I aspire to something bigger than this. And when you aspire to something bigger than where you are right now, that's the first step to sowing a path, to creating a path, to forging your own destiny and figuring out where it's going to take you. It's really sad, but too many people in prison never take the time to really engineer the outcome. They're only focusing on waiting for enough calendar pages to turn until they get out. But far too many people, when they get out, they find a world they don't know how to live in, a world that is rife with too many obstacles and too many challenges, and they can't overcome them. But if you're on this path, if you are pursuing the path of masterminds like Socrates, if you are learning from people like Gandhi and Mandela or Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, you will understand the relationship between every decision you make and your prospects for prosperity or success on the other end of this journey. I used to use this concept that I called the Quadrant Theory when I was in prison. It wasn't, again, my concept. It was a theory that I took from a mastermind. I think I learned it, if I recall, from a book I read about the stock market by Bernard Baruch, who was a great investor from the 1920s, I think from the 1920s. And he wrote about his method for picking investments. And what he said is that some investments have a high propensity for reward, but a high also propensity for risk. Some are low propensity for reward, a high propensity for risk. Some are high reward, low risk, high reward, low reward. There were 4 quadrants. It was high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low. One, risk and reward. Well, that worked for him with investments. It can work for you. It worked for me when I was in prison. I would determine my decisions every day. Did this have a higher propensity for taking me closer to my aspirations? And what was the commensurate risk? I was not a model inmate. I didn't abide by all the prison rules. My focus was never on being a model inmate. My focus was always on saying, I am going to emerge from prison strong, be able to land on my own 2 feet and build a career and not be handicapped or crippled because of the stupid decisions I made when I was 20. And so every decision I made inside was run through this filter of this quadrant theory. For example, let's just take a simple activity like watching television and why I would avoid watching television in prison. It's the same reason I don't watch television now, even though I've been out of prison for 2 years. What's the reward and what's the risk? Well, out here, I'll tell you my vision of it, but I'll tell you about it in prison. In prison, there are far too many people who would define their masculinity by their position in the TV room. Some of you may recognize this. There's one guy who's the alpha male and he can control the TV, and one guy sits in this seat and he controls this seat, and this is my important seat. And you got to ask yourself, do you want to play that game? Because if you play that game, there's a high propensity of risk. The reward, pretty low. What, you got to watch TV, you got to decide whether you're keeping up with the Kardashians or not, or watching NASCAR or whatever. In the grand scheme of things, that's a low reward. And the risk, very high. Why? Because if somebody sits in your seat, or if you sit in the wrong guy's seat and he's having a bad day, it can have lethal implications. And so you got to think about that before you pursue every activity. That is an example of what I would consider high risk, low reward. Why high risk? Because although I can control my behavior, I can't control the behavior of everyone around me. And if I don't want to get involved in the temperamental stories of prison, but instead I want to focus on my avatars and focus on my success on the future, I'm just going to avoid that type of high risk, low reward behavior. Let's take another one and say, what is high reward, low risk? High potential for reward, low potential for risk. Well, how about reading? Huge reward. Why? Because if I expand my vocabulary, I expand my knowledge, I expand my communication skills, I will simultaneously expand my ability to influence other people. I have had enormous support from so many people, business leaders, lawyers. I got married in prison. Why? Because I was able to persuade people to see me as something different from the bad decisions that I had made when I was 20. I was able to persuade people to see me as something other than a prisoner. But that didn't happen by accident. Every step was deliberate. High reward if I can learn to manipulate language. If I can learn how to string words and sentences and paragraphs into coherent messages, I can influence the way other people see me, including my case manager, including a probation officer, including a potential business owner, including a creditor. All of these people, I can influence the way that they see me. And I always understood that. And let's talk about the risk. Well, what lower risk can you have than being able to separate yourself from the herd, get into a niche, read, develop your vocabulary, learn how to write extensively? There's a very low risk because I'm not influencing anybody. In fact, I am separating myself from all of that risk. And that's what I want you to be thinking about. That is the lesson that I learned from masterminds. When Bill Gates said 30 years ago, I have a vision of putting a computer on every desk and in every home. Now, when he said that, people thought it was ridiculous. In fact, the CEO of, I think it was DEC, said, that's absurd. Nobody needs a computer in their home. But right now I could say you probably find more computers in homes than you find televisions. Why? Because Bill Gates had an aspiration. He had a vision of what he wanted to build. And it was the vision of a better world and the way that computers could enhance society and advance technology. And because he saw what other people didn't see, he knew that he had to take specific steps that would get him there. No different from any other mastermind. Mark Zuckerberg now has connected the world with Facebook. How did that begin? When this whole concept didn't exist 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whenever he was undergrad in school. You see, everything you do has a relationship to what you become, but it all begins with a vision. It all begins with an aspiration. I had an aspiration of coming back to society as a law-abiding, contributing citizen. And that's what carried me through 9,500 days of prison. My question for you is, what is your aspiration and how bad do you want it? Do you want it so bad that you'll work hard, that you'll tune out the negativity, that you'll reject the criminal lifestyle? Because if you do, that's what this Earning Freedom Mastermind course can truly work for you. So that's my message for today. We got another episode coming tomorrow. I want you to pay attention to this, and if you're listening to this message outside in society, I will ask you to help me be the change that I want to see in the world. And how can you do it? I'm not asking you to write a check. This costs no money. Very simply, go to iTunes, subscribe to the Earning Freedom podcast, rate and review the show. Don't care what kind of rating or review you get, just rate and review the show. And what that will do is it helps me get more distribution through iTunes. It helps me reach more people, and it helps me spread this message to people who need that hope and inspiration. I am Michael Santos with michaelsantos.com and prisonprofessor.com, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share the mastermind principles that guided me through 26 years in prison. Thank you. Okay, that's it.